Good evening. My name is Jennifer Chapman, and I am a member of the WHRO Public Media Emerging Leaders Board. We are a young professionals board made up of community-minded PBS and NPR nerds who love bringing people together to support public media. We are excited to bring you a virtual Independent Lens pop-up event with the screening of Recorder, the Marion Stokes Project. WHRO is excited to share public media's intriguing and captivating content to bring meaningful virtual experiences to you, highlight important topics, connect you to diverse perspectives, and bring community experts to enlighten and engage our audiences. Much of WHRO's content is available 24/7 online through Passport to WHRO members. For more information, go to passport.whro.org. Indie Lens Pop-Up is a neighborhood series that brings people together for film screenings and community-driven conversations. Featuring documentaries seen on PBS's Independent Lens, Indie Lens Pop-Up draws local residents, leaders, and organizations to discuss what matters most, from newsworthy topics and social issues to family and community relationships. We are excited about tonight's film, Recorder, the Marion Stokes Project, and the fascinating life of Marion Stokes, who secretly recorded television 24 hours a day for 30 years. Please stick around after the screening right here on OV for a pre-recorded panel discussion moderated by Barbara Ham-Lee, host of Another View, with panelists Dr. Jennifer Fish, sociology professor and chair of women's studies at Old Dominion University, Heather Hakimzadeh, curator at the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art, and Tim Siebels, professor, author, and former poet laureate of Virginia. Our moderator and panelists will be joining us live in the chat box located to the right of your screen to take questions from the audience, so please feel free to enter your reflections there during or after the screening. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the film. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for this post-screening panel discussion. This discussion was pre-recorded, but our panelists and moderator are live in the chat box located to the right of your screen right now. So please feel free to enter your questions and comments there. We're going to dive right in with our special guest. Serving as moderator for tonight's panel discussion is Barbara Ham-Lee, host of WHRO's Another View. Welcome, Barbara. Our panelists are Dr. Jennifer Fish. Jennifer Fish is chair of the Department of Women's Studies at Old Dominion University. She is a public sociologist with 25 years of research, teaching, and advocacy work in sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Fish is the author of 4 books and the director of 4 documentary films on women's labor, education, and human rights. She has conducted research with the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, along with several international organizations, government commissions, and universities worldwide. Welcome, Jennifer. Next, Tim Siebels is the author of several poetry collections, including Hurdy-Gurdy, Hammerlock, Buffalo Head Solos, and Fast Animal, which was a finalist for the 2012 National Book Award and winner of the Theodore Roethke Memorial Poetry Prize. Tim is a former NEA Fellow and recipient of a fellowship from the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center. His latest collection, One Turn Around the Sun, was released in 2017. He recently completed a 2-year appointment as Poet Laureate of Virginia. Welcome, Tim. And lastly, Heather Hakimzadeh. Gosh, Heather, I always say it wrong, is the curator of the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art, or Virginia MoCA. Heather will correct me on how I pronounce that. Since her tenure at MoCA, she has organized over 70 exhibitions ranging from local to internationally recognized artists. Some of her recent exhibitions include Inca Essenhigh, A Fine Line, Rest of History, and Todd Shore, Atomic Cocktail. She has contributed to Inca Essenhigh's monograph and the catalog that accompanied the seminal group exhibition, Turn the Page, The First 10 Years of High Fructose. Heather came to Virginia Beach in 2008 from Washington, D.C. During her stay in the D.C. area, she earned her master's degree in art history from George Washington University, while simultaneously working as an educator for the Phillips Collection. Prior to her museum career, Heather served for the United States Navy as an intelligence officer. Welcome, Heather. Now let's get started. Take it away, Barbara.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer, and good evening to everyone. Thank you, panelists, for joining me today. And Heather, pronounce your last name so that we can make sure that we have it correct.
It's Hakeemzadeh.
Hakeemzadeh, there you go. So I want to start, panelists, by asking you the question. You've all seen the documentary. What was the most striking thing that stood out for you in terms of who Marion Stokes was? What affected you as you were watching the documentary? What stood out the most to you? And I'm going to start with you, Jennifer Fish.
Thank you, Barbara. It's such a joy. I have to say I was so inspired by this story. I did not know this amazing woman. And I think what struck me most was her deep conviction and her passion as a visionary. I mean, what it took to record 70,000 VHS tapes over the course of nearly 30 years, and to see that as a statement to archive human history. I mean, what an incredible resource it is now. I was so moved by her passion, but also how that passion was situated in a particular social historical context and what it meant for social revolution and social change, not to mention news media at the time.
Mm-hmm. Tim, what about you?
What I really loved about her was that although she was a very small woman, she was really ferocious and absolutely convicted in what she thought and saw. Mm-hmm. And that was amazing on a couple levels. Number one, in her time, it was not common for a woman to be an intellectual, a public intellectual. Certainly not common for a Black woman to be a public intellectual. And lastly, to be so completely, I mean, unbridled in terms of what she would say, her interest in socialism and communism. I mean, those were dangerous things to be interested in for anybody. Certainly, exactly. A diminutive Black woman could have caught some hell from many communities for her interest in communism. So those are some of the things that stood out for me.
Okay. And what about you, Heather?
I think for me, I think visionary, that the word Jennifer used was such a good word, because I thought what was really interesting, especially at the beginning, is how they kept coding her as crazy. Oh, she's crazy, she's paranoid. And what she was right. Like, she was absolutely correct to archive this information, because I don't think people realize that the news stations were dumping their own archives. It wasn't being saved, and how important that she saw what that meaning was, and how important it was to track how stories evolved and how they were presented to the public, and how that coded our thinking as a public. And I said, so I think it's pretty typical for geniuses to be coded as crazy. I think it's especially easy to do it to women and to people of color. So that's what struck me is how, especially at the beginning of the documentary, they kept talking about her being paranoid and crazy. And then as you realized what she did, how you're like, nope, just a genius.
Absolutely. You know, what really struck me was, if you recall the scene where she had recorded every news station covering 9/11, and it showed the sequence in terms of how quickly the news station got to that point. I wonder what you think she would have thought about doing that exact transposition with what is happening today with the Black Lives Matter protests. In other words, starting from the early recordings in the 70s up through now. What do you think she would have thought about how news is being covered today in terms of Black Lives Matter? Tim, let me start with you.
Well, I think by everything I saw in terms of what she said and did, she anticipated that the news would be like this. We have now, God knows how many channels of news running at the same time. We can bounce all over the place, from right wing, way right, and all the way to the really progressive side. And it's all happening all the time, all at once. So I think she would have probably said, see, I told you so. I knew it was going to be like this. I was just setting the foundation for this kind of valuing of multiple voices, multiple simultaneous voices, you know.
Jennifer, do you think she would have been disappointed that we are more fractured now than we were when there were only 3 stations in the beginning?
I think to a certain extent, although I'm sure she would have appreciated the complexity and the diversity of the news, she was also about moving toward a world of social equality. In fact, the film says, if I'm in charge, everyone is equal. And so at one level, you know, the access to news and the immediacy of news with cell phones and everyday citizenship documentation, I think would have been very appealing, because she wanted news to break social norms and question reality. And so now we have much more access to that. And yet what she was looking for the world to become as a society, as we see now, is so far from that.
You know, Heather, when she was talking, she did a talk show in Philadelphia where oftentimes she was the only woman. How do you think, and I really wish I could have seen more of the conversations, because she seemed to really be able to hold her own. But do you think that her guests were more patronizing or really accepting of her ideas?
I think that would have depended on the guest. Honestly, I actually felt, I'm a former naval officer, and so I have had experience of being in a predominantly male profession, because I was active duty when the pterodactyls were launching off the aircraft carrier. So I think, again, I think it depended on who her guest was, but I think absolutely, you know, especially at the time in which she was on the TV and she was dealing with heavily male, heavily white authority within these social structures. So absolutely, I'm sure there was a little bit of the patronizing there of like, okay, sweetie, thank you. You know.
Yeah. Jennifer, you know, as a woman, she was extremely outspoken, I thought, and particularly as a Black woman, because her belief in communism, her socialism, and she didn't back down to a point where it actually affected her family life also. Do you think that in the documentary she was portrayed as being strong or as being the B word, which oftentimes we are called when we are strong?
I think she calls us to step outside of our normal associations about gender identity, in particular motherhood, because she is severed in her relationship with her son. She's abandoned herself by a stepmother, as we learn in her biography. And then she has these 2 interracial relationships, one of which becomes the ultimate expression of being understood, as she said. But she could also so easily be criticized for not being a solid mother, for not making motherhood her primary. And then also, as we mentioned, you know, the film portrays her inner world as on that edge of being, you know, OCD, is she a hoarder or a collector? And so I think that gender leaning, not to mention the racialized understanding of her presence, could tilt toward that because of the social norms in which we live. And yet that conviction, she saw her being as a woman and as a woman of color at the time as a way to progress social ideals and to use the news as a tool to really dismantle some common understandings and hierarchies.
Tim, I saw you shaking your head. You want to weigh in on that too?
Yeah, no, I think certainly you could, some people might want to call her the B word, but that's not the read I got on her. I think she was just someone who had really, you know, was deeply convicted about what she thought. I don't think, I never got the sense that she was being mean-spirited or
well, her stepdaughters may say something different.
No. I mean the talk show. No. Her family life, that's a different discussion. But I mean, I didn't get the impression that she was trying to belittle the other guests. Like, you know, the few sequences we saw when she was speaking, I didn't get the impression that she was, you know, talking down to people or I don't know, giving anyone anything but like what she really believed. I think this way, this is why. So that's not I didn't get a bad feeling for her as an intellectual or a public intellectual at all. As I said, her family life, that's a different discussion. Maybe we get into that later. She might have been a very difficult woman to be with in a more intimate way, but as a thinker, I just think she was, you know, really ferocious, and Lord knows, you know, we need such ferocity. We need it, you know.
Well, let's talk about her family life for a little bit, because as you alluded to, Jennifer, she was adopted or let go. Yeah, she was adopted by another family Her mother gave her up for adoption, but raised other children, which I think was a problem for her, that it really bothered her. And then she had a breakup with her own biological son. And then she had this relationship with her stepdaughters who were white. That was a lot to come together. And it seemed as though it was more important for her to keep people in their space in terms of how they related to her than to bring the whole family together. Did anybody get a different perspective on that? Heather, let's start with you.
I was gonna say, my main impression of her was just this extraordinarily fast intellect. And of anything of her life, she had confidence and faith in her own intellect. And so that when anybody kind of brushed up against that and challenged that, there was no way she was going to stand for that challenge, whether that came from in her family or without. And I think it was the anchor for which the rest of her decision making evolved and her relationships evolved. And I feel like if you could honor her intellect and acknowledge it, then perhaps you could move around her. But I feel like when young women are trying to assert themselves like her stepdaughters must have, they would have been bumping against that intellect, and it's just something she couldn't have handled. And that's kind of the impression.
The impression that you got. What about you, Jennifer? Oh, go ahead, Tim. I'm sorry, and then I'll come to you, Jennifer.
The other thing is that I mean, perhaps she would not have liked the challenge, but I also got the impression that if you could back your opinion as well as she could back her opinions, that she'd be fine with that. But you couldn't come at her with something thin,
Right.
I think that's my sense.
Yeah, exactly. I just don't think there were that many people in her orbit that could match her intellect.
Right. Well,
So yeah, she wasn't going to put up with even listening to it.
Yeah.
Jennifer, let me get your take, and then I want to add a little twist to this. Go ahead.
Of course you will, Barbara. Yeah, just your signature. I'm struck by the relationship to her son in the film. And so the son is such a prominent figure, and we get this lens into her life. And at first the son is so troubled by being quizzed by his mother. He talked about those 2-hour conversations or 2-day arguments about particular topics, and the secretiveness that she held in recording the news and keeping people outside the door, not answering the door. But I almost wonder if her family relations had to be calculated in the sense that she was so committed to that vision. She didn't want any disruption, and she was unconventional. So her relationships did not fit. And I think as we look at the film as adults and think, what would it be like to not have access to your father because of his wife? That's difficult to digest, and yet we're living into that gendered expectation as we imagine that.
Mm-hmm. But it wasn't as if she was unlovable, because her staff truly loved her, right? I mean, when they talked at the end when she passed, and the feelings that they had, her nurse and her chauffeur and the other gentleman. So clearly she had these relationships, but it didn't seem like she challenged them as much as she challenged her own.
Right.
But I also think they didn't question her vision. They didn't question her intellect. They acknowledged it. They respected it. They respected her as the authority, which I think gave her the space to show that love. I think, once she felt safe and trusted and acknowledged for the things she wanted to acknowledge, then she felt she could share the love and share the kindness.
Yeah,
the other thing, go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say, I got the impression that she had extremely high expectations for the people that she was close to in terms of family or beloveds or whatever. From what the first husband, if you recall, he just, after a while, apparently he'd been belittled so many times that he just left,
He couldn't take it. Yeah.
And her son ultimately also left for a while. I was really happy that they were able to reconcile by the end of the film. But I think she was very tough on the people she was closest to, and the people who worked for her. Maybe she just, gave them kind of space because they of course, weren't going to challenge her ideas or say anything to her, but probably yes, ma'am. So.
Absolutely. The other thing that was unique about her, and then we'll talk about the news part of this, but she was a millionaire. I mean, she was wealthy, and that was also something that was unheard of from the 70s through the time that she lived. The type of money that she had, the foundation, her investing in stock with Apple, and how critical that became as part of her life. But she gave back through these videotapes. So here's a question. Why do you think she did not change the technology of the recordings as time went on? Because they were all the videotapes that she had when she bought all the new Apple computers and all of that, but she never changed the method by which she did these daily recordings. Why do you think that is? Anybody have any speculation? Heather.
I was say, well, actually, I had been thinking about the fact that she was a librarian. That's how she started. So she was a natural archivist. And kind of combined with her paranoia, I've been giving this a lot of thought. It's interesting you brought this up because I think it was the most analog way of recording this in a way that she felt wasn't going to be watched by somebody else. Like having a VCR connected to a TV, that information that was being recorded wasn't going to be known outside of that apartment. And I was also wondering, like, is it consistency of archiving? Because if everything's in the same format, you can archive it. But I just had that because, like, she was a librarian, so I think the idea of creating an archive was a very natural thing to do, a natural source of inspiration for her. So
that's an interesting take on that, because to me I was like, I want, that didn't dawn on me, that perspective, but it did dawn on me is like, why wouldn't she just change as the technology changed? But she was very paranoid also, Jennifer. And so she really was worried about who was knowing what she was doing.
Right. My first sense, we need a psychologist, but I feel like there was a habituated nature in her process where she was memo writing each day, and it was running 3 to 5 TVs at a time. And I feel like that just built this habituated process. And we were wondering, when did she take a vacation? Did she ever leave the household? How do you possibly psychologically keep that running? So if that's your daily norm, I was imagining, how does one disrupt that and go to a whole new DVD technology? But you're right, Barbara, the idea that she invested in Apple and she was affiliated with Steve Jobs because he was also adopted. And so she then turned to that economic opportunity. I mean, there's a kind of randomness to her life and all these really complex intricacies that, make the fabric of who she is, which we only discover now after her 2012 passing.
Absolutely. I wish I had known about her before. I mean, because she sounds fascinating. I would have loved to have talked to her on Another View.
Yeah.
So what do you think she would think of the fact that now all of her work is actually being put on the internet? Because she was so private about recording these and keeping these. But do you think her ultimate goal was that the world be able to take advantage of the work that she did, Tim?
Yes, I do. I think she would be delighted that finally the stuff that she spent God knows how many years, about 30 years or something like that of news, archiving. I think she'd be delighted that people would have access to this information. In fact, she said that she was stewarding knowledge for the betterment of humanity. So I think the idea that this knowledge would be disseminated, I think that's exactly what she would want.
What do you think, Jennifer?
Well, I agree. And my quote from that moment was, she said, "The more we have, the more we know what is important." And I thought it was so interesting that she did not only record the major moments, September 11th, the Iran hostage situation in 1979, but she also recorded Oprah and Phil Donahue and TV commercials and talk shows. And it's as if she saw American society as this constellation and all these pieces fit together. So she was deeply invested in dismantling the power structure. And yet she was also interested in commercials. And you even see that in the quadrant view of what's happening in 9/11. There's a morning talk show, and then there's a commercial, and then we see the breaking news. And it really depicts how all those pieces were so important to her collectively.
I thought, Heather, what do you think? Do you think that also that she would be excited about the internet and about the fact that all of her work is available to all of us?
I absolutely do. I think she was secretive because she didn't want that archive destroyed before it could be disseminated. I
Mhm.
think, because now that once it's out into the world, nobody's going to be able to wreck it. I mean, because that's how victors win, is they destroyed the knowledge of the culture. It destroy libraries and they destroy, so I think that was her, biggest concern, is that it would be stopped before it could be disseminated to the world, the wider world. And so now that it's out there, it's out there.
It is definitely out there. So one of the things that she said in the film, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she was talking about news and how it depends on who's telling your story. And I know, Heather, that the work that you're doing at MoCA, you have an exhibit there where there are artists who are pushing that idea forward through their art, in terms of who's telling the story. I know one of the artists is Titus Kaphar, who we've covered on Another View in the past. And you want to talk to us a little bit about him and his work and how, the juxtaposition between what he is doing and basically what she did by making these recordings.
Absolutely. I'm just first going to talk, the name of the exhibition is entitled Shifting Gaze, the Reconstruction of the Black and Hispanic Body in Contemporary Art. And it's a traveling exhibition that came up from the Manalo Museum in Florida. And it has 27 artists who are Black and Hispanic, and their take on contemporary art and their approach to contemporary art making. But Titus Kaphar, I'm actually going to bring up. I'm going to share the screen real quickly and bring up the work. This is working.
There you go.
There you go. It's called Columbus Day Painting. So Titus Kaphar is a Yale graduate. He is a MacArthur Fellow winner. He is a genius. In fact, I do have an image of him. And he is creating a body of work where he's confronting art history and from its source, and he's rewriting and redefining how we look at it. He's bringing it into kind of a contemporary look and context. And this work right here, Columbus Day Painting, is the work that we have up right now at MoCA. And it is based on a painting by a man named John Vanderlyn, and that's the original, that was created in 1847. This piece is hanging in the rotunda of the US Capitol. And so what Titus Kaphar has done is he has encased most of the main figures in linen. He's wrapped them up like mummies, so you can't really see who they are anymore. But what that does, it literally does shift your gaze and make you look at the rest of the painting. So you'll see in the right-hand corner the natives who were originally occupying this West Indies island, which is now, I think, known as San Salvador. And you can see the really racist take on who these peoples were. They look primitive. They look frightened. They're not wearing clothes, which we know is, like, a Christian nation. That would not have been that would have been seen as being as proof of being not cultured and not as a primitive. But I also want to point out that once the figures are covered, you can also see all the weapons that they're carrying. So we talk about them being just explorers and pioneers, but their intentions, this wasn't Star Trek. Their intentions, they were armed. So they were prepared to meet peoples and to be violent. And he's claiming the land for Spain. He has a Spanish flag. And it's like, but there are people there. And so you start to ask yourself questions like, well, wait, pioneer or invader? Conqueror? And I would also like to mention a couple of things about, I really think his choice of this painting is really important for a couple of reasons. The first is it is hanging in the US Capitol, so thousands and thousands of visitors see this painting every year. And although it didn't receive a lot of fanfare when it first came out, it has been on 2 different stamps in the 19th century. And it was also on the back of the $5 bill in the 1870s. So this painting isn't just in one little building where only certain amounts of people saw it. It became part of the lexicon of Columbus and his myth in the United States. And this painting in particular kind of brought that forward. And so like Marion, Titus is like asking us to really look at these structures that form narrative and form our opinions on the way things happen. I mean, I think we were all in grade school. I was in the grade school in the 70s, and how the Christopher Columbus myth is perpetuated starts there, and it starts with myth making, with art, and with culture, in our cultural structures of libraries and books and paintings. And it's really important to know where they came from, which I think is what Marion was trying to do. She's like, we need to understand how our narratives are being built. And I think that's what she was doing specifically with her archive, and that's what Titus is doing with his body of work.
You know, I have to tell you, Heather, I looked at this picture several times, and until you put it up just now, I just saw the people,
right,
the Native Americans. It's breathtaking, you know, when you really examine it that way. There was another artist, I believe, that you were working with also that you wanted to share with us.
Absolutely. His name is Samuel Levy Jones, and he is also interested in the structures that create knowledge. And this piece, let's see if I can, is titled "Love is Complicated." And so what he's doing is he's taking books apart, because again, books are a social structure that form our knowledge base, that form our culture. And you can't see the titles of these books, except that there's two titles when you see this particular piece in person that you can see. And one is called Ethnicity in the United States. Now, I tried to do my research, and there are a lot of books with that title that are different. So I wasn't quite sure which one they were talking about, but I will say that they're almost all inevitably are textbooks. And they all, you know, prior to maybe this year, these textbooks are going to be very skewed and biased, and they will hierarchy race, and they will introduce all kinds of fallacies, and they will do it within the school system. And so it's really important to know that that's how these assumptions and these biases are getting built in. They're getting built in from the beginning in school. And the other book that you can see is entitled The Book of Knowledge, which I did a little research on this. The Book of Knowledge was actually a children's encyclopedia that ran from 1912 to 1960. And it was really biased. About at least 80% of the figures in the book and the pictures were Caucasian. Those that were people of color were usually shown in images of violence. And intentionally or unintentionally, again, it skews vision, and it's giving the vision of children from the get-go. It's creating that bias. And so Samuel Levy Jones is taking apart these books. He's like literally physically tearing them apart to rebuild knowledge, to rebuild and make us re-understand what is actually happening when we create social structures in the United States, and to understand that they're on purpose. Like the coding that was in Titus Kafar's piece, the coding that is in this piece, is to have us understand that these things aren't on accident, they're not organic. They're the result of decisions and decision making, and they do skew our thinking, and they do change how we think about the world. And I think that they do tie in very nicely to the things that Marion was talking about.
Okay. Well, then let me ask the two authors in our group, Jennifer and Tim, because both of you have written books, and you write from the perspective of today. So as we look at what these artists have done with their work, and they're saying, you know, pay attention, look at it from a different perspective, is that an expectation you have that people in the future will look at your work, or are you simply responsible for recording the world as you see it today and let them figure it out, the next generation, if that makes sense? Does that make sense?
At a certain point, I think every artist, at least the artists that I value most, their main responsibility is to say the thing, paint the thing, dance the thing, sing the thing that they really,
Poetry about the thing.
right. You know, I mean, that's their job, to be true to whatever it is that they're hearing inside themselves. And if they're careful with their craftsmanship, then someone who is not connected directly to them will get a clear sense of maybe what was intended. But the other thing is, the viewer is also responsible for thinking about what he or she is seeing. So if I write a poem, for example, I can't realistically expect someone to read the poem and say, I know exactly why Tim wrote this. No one, of course you don't. I mean, my life is a particular thing, but if I've done the work that I should do, then there should be some quintessence that is communicated that reminds you of something that is in fact a part of your life. And when you think about Marion Stokes, well, goodness gracious, we are bombarded by media. Her job, I think, maybe was to remind us just how bombarded we are, you know, perhaps. And that's one of her main messages, just the idea that someone could have 70,000 tapes suggests that there's a lot of media out there to be taped. And now there's 25 times more than when she started, you know, or 1,000 times
exactly.
more. So I think, you know, I don't know that anyone's going to go through every tape. I can't imagine that, but they'll get maybe a flavor for what media was once and how what it was became what it now is. Maybe that's it. You know?
Jennifer, the same question to you. Is it, when you write, are you thinking about the moment and what's happening in your perspective, or are you also thinking about what will someone from the future see, understand, think about when they read this?
I do feel a resonance with Marion Stokes in the sense of thinking into the future and documenting particularly the stories that are not a part of that mainstream news. I mean, she talked about mainstream stories and symbols, to reference our art colleagues, as being a way of manipulating daily life and telling a predominant story. She said those in power are able to write their own story. And so as an author and a documentarian, I feel like my job is to tell in as much detail as possible the story of what's existing now. And then of course that will get interpreted into the future, just as we're trying to understand VHS recording now. But I think that she really calls us to work at such a level of detail to honor the stories and the subjects and the participants of today. And it makes me think about this moment, this surreal crisis, which is falling so disproportionately on marginalized communities, and how we can document the details of that will be so meaningful in our future. Not only our physical existence in terms of public health, but the trauma and the way that particular communities are living through the COVID-19 process makes me want to go out and capture that in even more detail, given the inspiring model she offers.
Yeah, she really was a pioneer, and I wonder, as we look at media today, what would be the lessons that you think she would want us to take away so that we can do media better now than we were doing it then? Is there anything that sticks out to you that says that she would really want us to, for example, for me, it would be more people, particularly people of color, particularly African Americans, in charge of news departments? You know, because in television news, we know that the majority of leadership are people who are not Black and who are covering Black communities and have a different perspective of Black communities than perhaps a Black person would have. So I think she would say to us, we need to expand that and to make sure that we're more inclusive in terms of who determines what stories we're going to hear and how we're going to hear them. Is there anything else that jumped out at you guys?
Well,
Heather, start with you. Or Tim, you ready?
I was just going to say, I think that certainly she would want Black folks and other people of color, of course, to be better represented in the media. But I also think she really wants us to be, and she talks about the power of mass media to shade or distort the public's view. And I think one of the things she would really want from us is a more intensely thoughtful engagement with the media. Don't just look at stuff and say, oh, okay, and walk away. You just have to say, okay, who's speaking? what are they trying to convince me of? Why are they trying to convince me of that? And what am I not hearing? Because I think that's something often people don't ask. What am I not hearing? So that's, I think she would love it, you know, if there were more Don Lemons and more Barbara Ham Lees just out there saying, this is what you're not hearing, this.
Yeah, yeah. Jennifer.
Well, one of my favorite quotes from the film was she said, "We have to be deeply engaged with people living a different reality than our own." And I think the news allows for that. And of course, the assault on the news over the course of the last 3 years would be deeply troubling, I believe, not to mention the news conglomerates and the way in which their control over a particular message creates kind of, you know, opium of the masses, kind of mainstream norm about not questioning reality and not questioning who benefits from the particular symbols and messages that are promoted. I believe she would be deeply troubled by the way the news has become a figure of this banality of everyday thinking.
And she was very keen and understood, particularly when the cable news networks started, that they were going to struggle with trying to fill that 24-hour news hole. And she talked about how this was an opportunity for smaller towns and other stories that normally wouldn't make the national news now had an opportunity to do that. But at the same time, she also talked about the repetition and the way that the stories were told. So she was very astute in terms of news coverage. As we start to wrap up, I want to hear from each of you in terms of what you think is the most important lesson that we can take today as we grapple with Black Lives Matter, as we grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic. Those are the two major stories, and our political elections that are coming up. You know, what should we be doing to be critical consumers of news based on all of these factors that have a major impact on our lives? How should we become more critical thinkers, as you talked about, Tim, as we watch news coverage? And what should we be demanding of our local news in particular, because that's what we can control the fastest, as well as our national news. So I know that's a lot, but but just give, you know, our listening audience just some food for thought in terms of, instead of just turning the TV on and having it as background noise, what do we need to be really critically thinking about as we're consuming this information? And I'm going to start with Tim.
With me?
Yeah, with you.
I'm sorry.
Is your name Tim? You're the only guy on the screen.
Anyway, and she also, I think she also said this, she made some mention of a re-examination of what was normal. And I think that can be applied to how we look at television. I mean, when we think of the current occupant of the White House, for example, a certain kind of behavior has become, quote unquote, normalized. And I think when people just kind of proceed like, oh, yeah, no, this is fine, okay, this is just another president. I think when people behave as though this particular person is just another president, I think it's dangerous. I think it means we become numb to a certain extent to a certain kind of really outside kinds of behavior and potentially dangerous kinds of behavior. And I think we can extend that into many, many, many directions. I mean, the idea that the news becomes more about the personality of the broadcaster rather than the actual story. I mean, these are all things we have to think about. What's becoming normal and how are we ingesting it? And how is the normal that the media is creating changing the normal that we're living? I think those are all things that I would like to think she might wish we would do.
Okay. And that's Tim Siebels. He's the former poet laureate and author and professor and all-around good guy. Yes, he is. Heather, I'm going to come to you next. What do you think that, what is one takeaway that we can give to people as they consume news now? What do we need to be thinking about?
I think both Tim and Jennifer have really hit on this, which is who it is that's telling the news and who it is that's shaping the narrative. Because what really struck me is that this began for her with the Iran hostage crisis in the late 70s, and how she was struck on how the narrative was changing as the story went on. And I think that's happening now. I think the story of the Black Lives Matter movement has been changing the longer it's been on the news, and why that is, and to question that, and to engage with that. And my little, please vote. These power structures are really important. And I think that's what she wanted us to recognize and to acknowledge, is that these structures are out there and they're designed to let some people in and keep some people out. But if you have the opportunity to step into them, do it. Use your voice, use your power. I think that was really important to Marian.
I agree, and that's Heather Hakumzadeh with MoCA, which is a Museum of Contemporary Art in Virginia Beach. Thanks so much, Heather. And Jennifer, you get the last word.
Well, Barbara, I'll put a plug in, as I do with all my students, to please look at international news. Please look at how the U.S. is positioned globally. I was just talking with a friend from South Africa this morning, and she said, "I'm so sorry your country's at war. We're all in solidarity with America right now." And in the U.S.,
Wow.
we're still hearing the narrative of this being, the essential elite country, and that is not the global perspective. So I think anything we can do to widen our awareness of how the U.S. is positioned
That just took my breath away.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, from Cape Town.
That's the way that she perceived it.
Mm-hmm.
And and when you really think about it, she's not wrong. But but it just, to hear that perspective from someone who's outside the country, that's not a good message.
And when can we remember when holding a U.S. passport disallowed travel, when continents were not allowing citizens of this country to enter? I mean, this is the next wave of what we're facing. So in the spirit of leaving on a positive note, though, I wanted to cite one more time Marian Stokes, who said, "If you have faith in the democratic process, make it work." And I believe she would say that the news is a democratic process, and we are all obligated to take part in that and challenge that and build a diversity of stories in that.
Absolutely. And that is Jennifer Fish, who is the head of the Women's Studies Department over at Old Dominion University. Did I get that right? Okay. Thank you, panel, so much for being with us and for this great discussion. And I'm going to kick it back over to Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to our moderator, Barbara Hamley, and our amazing panelists for such an insightful discussion this evening. And thank you, our audience, for joining us this evening. To see more of the artwork in Virginia MoCA's current exhibition, Shifting Gaze, a reconstruction of the Black and Hispanic body in contemporary art, be sure to visit virginiamoca.org for more information on obtaining tickets. Admission is free. We also hope you will join us and bring your friends to our next Emerging Leaders Board event, which is called Imagine That. It's a virtual game of creative collaboration that builds bonds over crazy ideas, crafty solutions, which takes place virtually on August 6th. And for more information on how to register for Imagine That and to see other upcoming WHRO events, please visit whro.org/events. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye.